Okay, so this is an example of an elastic demand curve, relatively elastic, price elastic demand curve, and you can tell it is because it's relatively it's flatter, and if price goes up, let's say for example price goes up P1 to P2, then quantity demanded goes down from Q1 to Q2. But as you can see on this diagram, the change in price is smaller than the change in demand. So there's a greater change in the quantity demanded compared to the change in price. So therefore we say this product is relatively elastic. So any product where you might put the price up a small amount but demand falls by a lot is an elastic product. So price elasticity is elastic. So there tends to be products that have a lot of substitutes. So if I put up the price of, let's say, this pen, then you just go buy another pen. So it's a very elastic, price elasticity is very elastic, it's relatively elastic. And the same would be if the price went the other way. So if the price goes down, then quantity demanded increased by relatively a greater amount. And that is a price, a relatively elastic price, quantity demanded. Right, so if we just change that then, let's say for example the demand curve looks like this. Okay, so this is your demand curve. Then we would say actually that's a relatively inelastic demand curve. And you can tell it's relatively inelastic because in this case, let's say if we have price P1 and quantity at that level was Q1, let's say if we put up price by a relatively great amount to P2, okay, so it goes from P1 to P2, but actually the quantity demanded doesn't fall much at all. So this is a relatively inelastic, price elasticity is relatively inelastic because the change in quantity demanded is relatively small compared to, it's smaller than the change in price. So we would call that an inelastic demand curve. So that would be a product that doesn't have many substitutes. So for example, if you put up the price of petrol, it might be that you can't go anywhere else to buy that petrol. You need that petrol, it's a necessity, so therefore you pay that extra price. So therefore the price elasticity is very inelastic. Apple products, there's a lot of brand loyalty to Apple products. So if they put up the price of an iPhone, so if you take the new iPhone 12, that's, you know, it's £1,000, well, people will still pay that because they want an Apple phone. And maybe if they want the apps that are specific to the Apple, then they have to buy that Apple phone and they don't have a choice. As more competition comes into that market, then actually what happens is that demand curve will become relatively more elastic. And you could argue that that actually is starting to happen with smartphones. Although there's a lot of brand loyalty to Apple, that actually as more substitutes come into the market that are good, they may not be able to put up that price quite as high. So you would actually, their demand curve would become relatively more elastic. So it will become flatter over time. But that would be, at the moment, that is an inelastic demand curve because as price goes up, quantity demanded will fall, but by a lesser percentage than that increase in price. So overall, if you have an inelastic demand curve, you can put up the price and the quantity of revenue you receive, which will actually increase. Now, revenue, total revenue, is worked out by price times quantity. So if you look at this diagram, at P1, that is the total revenue at price, because it's price times quantity at P1. You put the price up to P2, then that is your total revenue, which is actually greater than what it was previously. So if you have a very inelastic demand for your product, then actually you can benefit from increasing the price.